You think you know King Henry VIII, the gluttonous monarch with 6 unlucky wives and a crown smeared in gravy and betrayal, but beneath the portraits and power plays, there was a secret that history textbooks tiptoe around. A secret that seeps from the bedchamber like a slow, dark stain. In every palace, there is one room no one dares whisper about. And for Henry, it was the bed. Not the throne room, not the chapel, not the battlefield, but the bed where flesh rotted, faith collapsed, and women were broken not by war, but by the thing that once claimed to love them. This was not a love story. This was the slow decomposition of a man who could not admit he was crumbling. A king who turned his insecurities into execution orders, and a legacy that began not with coronation, but with the stink of death beneath silk sheets. It began quietly, as all horror stories do, with whispers behind curtains and the soft rustle of servants lighting candles near legs that refused to heal. By the year 1536, Henry's body was no longer obeying the myth. Beneath his royal robes and golden garters, open wounds festered endlessly on both legs. Ozink pus, attracting flies, and emitting a stench so unbearable that courtiers would soak their clothes in rosewater and still retch when he entered the room. Imagine lying beside that. Imagine being Anne Boleyn, crowned and doomed, pretending not to gag, while the king, your husband, your captor, your sentence tossed and turned, bones audibly crackling beneath fat and fever, his breathing laboured, his groans more beast than man. And still, she was expected to smile, to sleep beside him, to pretend his flesh wasn't decomposing in real time, that the King of England wasn't rotting from the inside out, inch by inch, night after night. But it wasn't just the legs. That was merely the doorway. Medical historians now suspect Henry suffered from osteomyelitis, a rare and agonizing bone infection that not only devoured his flesh, but invaded his mind, sending waves of pain through his joints and brain until his temper wasn't just cruelty, but chemical torment. The violent outbursts, the unpredictable rages, the sudden reversals of affection, they weren't merely arrogance, but agony. His court feared him not because he was powerful, but because he was sick. And a sick king is far more dangerous than a sane one, especially when that sickness is buried beneath layers of denial, ritual, and holy oil, masked with incense and false smiles, while beneath it all, his body quietly declared war on itself. Each night became a ritual of rot. Servants were required to change his bandages, draining abscesses that never closed, holding their breath as the smell thickened the air like smoke. Some reportedly vomited at the sight. Others passed out. It was said that the scent of him lingered in rooms for hours after he left, like a warning. But still, the queens came. They were summoned to the same bed: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, and whether they feared him or pitied him or hoped to survive him, they all learned the same unspoken truth. No one escapes the bed. Not unmarked, not unchanged, not alive. In some cases, and the bed, oh, the bed, it wasn't just a place of rest or romance. It became the battlefield of Henry's most personal wars, between his ego and his impotence, between his body and his soul, between the king he pretended to be and the man who cried out in pain when no one was watching. It was in that bed that Anne Boleyn first heard the sound of bones shifting unnaturally beneath royal skin. It was in that bed that Catherine Howard sobbed silently for hours before being called to serve not love, but fear. It was in that bed that Henry tried and failed to prove he was still a man, still a god, still more than the rotting meat beneath the crown. You will hear people say that Henry broke with the Pope for love, that he created the Church of England for power, that he executed his wives for treason. But listen carefully, peel back the politics. And what you will find is the bed, always the bed, always the wound that would not heal, the smell that would not leave, the women who did not live. And now, as you drift towards sleep, consider this. The most terrifying monsters in history do not live in caves or castles. They live in beds. They breathe beside you. They smile through decay. And sometimes they wear a crown. There are deaths that happen quickly, like the flash of a sword or the crack of a scaffold. And then there are deaths that come slowly, almost politely, entering the body like a guest who never intends to leave. And King Henry VIII, for all his might and terror, was dying long before he ever wore black for any of his queens. He was dying by degrees, rotting not just from within, but from beneath a sovereign whose feet had long since begun their quiet rebellion, whose legs had ceased to be loyal subjects, and whose flesh betrayed him in the very chambers where he once believed himself divine. You must understand that a king's body is not merely his own. It is a symbol, a myth, an illusion that must be maintained at all costs. And so, when Henry's body began to collapse inward one ulcer at a time, it was not just a physical failure, but the beginning of a royal unraveling, a corrosion of myth, and ultimately, a descent into something far more terrifying than death helplessness. The first true signal arrived in the year 1536. That was the year everything changed. That was the year of the accident. Henry had been a man of stature, not just in title, but in form tall, broad, athletic, known for jousting and hunting, for charging into sport as if war itself had come calling. But when he was thrown from his horse during a tournament, everything that had once held him upright began to give way. The fall was brutal, the impact tremendous, and though no bone was declared broken, something inside him shifted, something deep, something essential, something that never healed. His legs, once steady pillars of royal movement, began to swell, to ache, to burn with pain that no ointment or poultice could soothe. In time, open sores developed near his shins, raw lesions that refused to close, that wept fluid and festered and darkened. And beneath the skin, something deeper began to brew, a heat, a throbbing, a pressure that no one could name. His physicians were baffled, his surgeons helpless, and his enemies silent, because even they could smell what was happening. By the time the court began to whisper of infection, it was already too late. The ulcers had become wounds. The wounds had become caverns, and inside those caverns, disease festered like a living thing. His bandages had to be changed multiple times a day, not by gentle hands, but by trained attendants with iron stomachs. For the smell was no longer one of illness. It was the smell of decomposition, of something long past saving. And when the wrappings were removed, there were days when the king himself turned his head away. Servants burned sage and lavender. Candles infused with rose and myrrh lined every hallway he passed through. But the scent was patient. It lingered. It permeated silk and stone and soul, until even his bed, once a place of power and pleasure, reeked of the grave. Yet the true horror was not the stench, nor the sight of bandages soaked in fluids that bore no resemblance to blood, but the sound, for when Henry moved, his body groaned, not in the theatrical way of a man rising from a throne, but in the quiet, brittle way of bone, rubbing against bone, of joints grinding where cartilage had long since vanished. There are accounts, private letters hidden in archives, journal entries never meant to be read aloud, that describe nights where the only sound in the royal chamber was the brittle clicking of his skeleton as he shifted in agony. Anne Boleyn, it is said, once wrote that she could not sleep because she feared the king would die beside her in the night. Not with a scream, but with a slow, wet sigh and the sound of his hip cracking open beneath the weight of his own regret. Whether the letter is authentic or apocryphal hardly matters, because everyone who shared that bed came to understand the same thing. The king was no longer whole. His mood, already mercurial, darkened further. Where once he had laughed easily and loved extravagantly, he now brooded, pacing the halls when he could still walk, lashing out when the pain became too great to bear. His legs were bandaged so tightly that some suspected he no longer had full sensation in his feet. And on stormy days, when the weather shifted and the bones inside him swelled with the change in pressure, it was said that the king howled, not metaphorically, not royally, but like an animal, like a wounded beast surrounded by mirrors that only showed him what he once was and would never be again. Physicians suggested bleeding. Others recommended mercury. None of them dared utter the words that trembled on the edges of every diagnosis: madness, infection, decline. And what of the women? What of the queens, summoned to lie beside this ruin of a man? History does not give them a voice. It gives them titles. It gives them death dates. But it does not tell you how they breathed shallowly beneath the canopy, praying the wind would shift the stench away from their face. It does not tell you how their maids scrubbed their hair with vinegar to remove the scent of his rot. It does not tell you how they flinched when he touched them with hands swollen and red, fingertips thick with heat and bitterness. Nor does it tell you what it feels like to hear your husband sob while he thinks you sleep. Because the pain has become too much, and pride is the only thing keeping him from admitting he is no longer a king in body or mind. There are small clues, if you know where to look. Servants began to speak of strange items being burned in the fireplace: old linens, bloodied trousers, boots soaked through at the heel. Courtiers were discouraged from lingering too near the royal presence. New incense burners were installed in every chamber. The court alchemist was summoned more frequently, and through it all, the king remained in denial. He still danced, though briefly. He still insisted on feasts, though he could barely chew without gasping. And he still married, again and again, as if love might redeem what flesh had destroyed. But the body has its own laws, and Henry's body, though clad in velvet and armour, followed those laws with grim determination. The ulcers never closed. The swelling never stopped. The pain never eased. Some nights, the king would wake screaming, not from dreams, but from the simple act of turning too quickly and tearing open the skin near his knee. His sheets had to be changed constantly, his pillows stained, and as the infections deepened, so too did the fractures in his mind. For pain, unrelenting pain, does not leave a man untouched. It whispers, it poisons, it turns faith into fury, love into suspicion, and memory into rage. Henry began to suspect everyone. That his wives were mocking him, that his courtiers pitied him, that his servants plotted against him. He saw betrayal in every sideways glance, poison in every goblet, and insult in every mirror that dared reflect his current form. And when you are a king, a true, absolute monarch, you do not confront those fears. You destroy them. So the bed remained, the bed and the man within it. A bed soaked in perfumes and prayers, a man wrapped in silk and sickness, both of them slowly becoming something darker, something tragic, something terrifying. They called him Defender of the Faith. They called him Supreme Head of the Church of England. But as the candlelight dimmed and the corridors emptied, and only the faint groan of bone and linen remained, he was simply a man whose body had become a prison, a man who no longer ruled his limbs, his pain, or his pride. A man who, each night, lay in a bed that remembered every failure his kingdom could not. And somewhere, beyond the stone walls and beyond the reach of royal denial, the truth remained that even kings must bow to the body when it begins to rot. Power, when stripped of poetry and robes, becomes theatre, and King Henry VIII was its greatest playwright, producer, and star, staging scenes of love and punishment on the grandest stage of all his court. But unlike the dramas of Shakespeare, where tragedy unfolds with subtlety and remorse, Henry's performances were cruel, deliberate, and drenched in blood, written not in ink, but in severed ties and severed heads. And as his body broke down, as his legs turned from flesh to wound, and his nights filled with moans instead of sleep, Henry discovered that the only way to quiet his inner rot was to orchestrate the public destruction of others. For every failing organ, a scapegoat. For every impotent knight, a woman accused. For every painful step, a head removed. This was not governance. This was theatre, and no one played their part more tragically than Anne Boleyn. Anne had once been everything Henry claimed to want: fiery, intelligent, unapologetically defiant, a queen of the new order. Crowned not by tradition but by obsession. He tore down a church for her. He ripped apart a kingdom for her. And then, when his legs grew more rotten than royal, and her womb failed to give him the son he demanded, he turned on her with a fury so methodical it could only be described as stagecraft. He didn't simply order her execution. He wrote her ruin as if it were a play. First came the whispers, planted and watered carefully, rumors of witchcraft, of seduction, of unnatural acts behind closed doors. Then came the charges: adultery, incest, treason, not whispered now, but proclaimed. Anne was accused of sleeping with multiple men, including her own brother George. The court gasped. The people murmured. But Henry, the man who once begged the Pope for permission to marry her, sat with still hands and eyes that betrayed nothing but anticipation. This was the performance. This was the moment he had written for himself. She was forced to stand trial, but not alone. Her brother was tried first. He was dragged into the courtroom, pale and composed, knowing what had already been decided. The evidence was fabricated, the witnesses false, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the spectacle, the audience gasping at every accusation, the jurors nodding along to a script they had memorized in fear, and Henry watching from behind the curtain, not as a grieving king, but as a director checking cues. When George Boleyn was sentenced to death, Anne was made to watch. And not just watch, she was made to listen as his name was dragged through filth, as his dignity was burned alive, as his life was reduced to a prop in her own annihilation. And then came her turn. Anne stood trial not just for treason, but for being a woman who had once held too much power, too much charm, too much influence over a man who no longer had control over his own reflection. She was called a witch, a séductrice, a manipulator. And in the gallery, seated among nobles and vipers, was the little girl who would one day become Elizabeth I, 11 years old, silent, watching her mother's name be torn apart, her future smeared with shame, her inheritance poisoned by a lie too big to erase. Historians have long debated the truth of that moment. Did Elizabeth truly sit in the gallery? Did she hear the slurs and the accusations? Or is it merely a symbol, a haunting image left by time to remind us that in Henry's kingdom, even innocence was not spared from the script, whether she was there in flesh or only in legacy? The result was the same: a daughter taught, too young. That power is pain wearing a crown. And through it all, Henry smiled. There are letters first-hand accounts, journal entries from nobles and servants alike, that describe him laughing during the trial. Laughing, as his once beloved was torn apart in front of an entire nation, as her honor was flayed, and her family destroyed. His joy was not just in her death, but in her humiliation. For this was not justice. This was a show. This was a punishment for her refusal to fade quietly. And it was a declaration to all who remained: if you cause me pain, I will make a martyr of your shame. Anne was executed on a scaffold within the walls of the tower. Her death was quiet, dignified, whispered. But it was not the sword that destroyed her. It was the performance leading up to it. And Henry returned to his meals, to his horses, to his swollen legs and aching bones. And within a week, he was courting Jane Seymour. As if Anne had been a line that no longer suited the script, deleted, forgotten, recast. But the play did not end there. For when Catherine Howard entered his life young, vibrant, terrified, the theatre took on a darker hue. She was barely 19. He was well past 40. His body was already betraying him daily. And yet he brought her into the same chambers where Anne had once wept, where the scent of rosewater could not hide the decay that lingered in his footsteps. Catherine was not a queen. She was a prop, a consolation, a symbol that Henry still had control, that he could still marry, still dominate, still create heirs. But she cried every night. The palace walls are said to have echoed with her sobs, muffled by pillows, ignored by guards. Servants wrote of hearing her whispers behind doors, begging not to be called. Not tonight. Not again. But the script had been written. She was to play the loving wife, the willing partner, the vessel of redemption for a king crumbling under his own illusions. When rumours of her past, of flirtations, of indiscretions reached Henry, he did not investigate. He did not question. He saw the moment, the drama, the next act. She was arrested, imprisoned, accused, and then executed, just like Anne. Different name, same curtain, because that was Henry's court, a theatre of blood, a pageant of humiliation. And behind the velvet, behind the throne, behind the mask of majesty, was a man who could no longer bear the sound of his own bones breaking in the night, and so he silenced others instead. This was not monarchy. This was madness in a crown, a sickness too proud to be named, a playwright who had lost control of his actors, but who still insisted the show must go on. And in that theatre, love was never real, only roles. She was only a girl, barely 19 summers old. When the palace swallowed her whole, a child in pearls, dressed up like a queen, handed over to a man whose touch was no longer warm, but wet with the scent of rot and the weight of things unspoken. Catherine Howard did not walk into love, nor was she courted in gardens with music and sonnets like the stories once told by the old maids in her uncle's household. No, she was delivered, handpicked, positioned, and wrapped in silk, not for celebration, but for strategy. Her youth was her weapon, or so the court thought. And Henry, bloated by power and boiling inside his own wounded skin, reached for her not with affection, but with desperation, for if he could still claim a girl like her, perhaps he could still claim control over the man he used to be. But Catherine was not a threat. She was not cunning like Anne, not steady like Catherine of Aragon, not ghost-like like Jane Seymour. She was soft, too soft, a girl who liked music, who laughed when no one was watching, who blushed when men bowed to her not because she was flirtatious, but because she had never been taught the difference between courtly games and the cage that now surrounded her. She was not raised for survival. She was raised for sweetness. But sweetness is a dangerous thing in the court of a dying king, because it can neither protect you nor make sense of the nightmare unfolding in the shape of royal ceremony. It simply shatters. They say she cried at night and not quietly, not politely, like a queen who knew the rules of suffering. She cried like a girl who had no mother to run to, who had no sister in the next room, who had no language for the horror of being touched by a man whose legs leaked pus into the bedsheets. She cried into pillows, into sleeves, into silence, and the sound of her sobbing became part of the architecture of Hampton Court, seeping through walls, slipping beneath doorways, curling beneath the feet of servants who dared not speak her name. For a time, her sobs were so frequent that one maid was dismissed for daring to suggest the Queen be given laudanum to sleep. Henry found out and flew into a rage. Not because he cared about Catherine's tears, but because no one was allowed to suggest the king could not satisfy his wife. There was no joy in their union, only a theatre of obligation. Catherine was expected to attend to him, to comfort him, to kneel when he demanded reverence, and to smile when he groaned beneath the weight of his own decay. The bedchamber became her prison, and worse than a prison, it was a ritual site where she was summoned nightly not for affection, but for confirmation that he was still king, that he was still capable, that God had not abandoned him. Even as his bones began to feel like fire beneath the skin, and his temper became less of a mood and more of a storm that never passed. Some nights, she tried to sing to herself, quietly, in Latin, as she had once done as a schoolgirl, back when her biggest worry was being caught sneaking a sweet cake or dancing barefoot in a hallway. But the echoes were different now. Now, her voice sounded like mourning, like a lullaby for the living who knew death was coming, but could not guess from which direction. And the walls, those old Tudor walls heavy with smoke and secrets, and held every note of her song as if they too had begun to pity her. Henry, of course, saw none of this, or rather, he refused to see it. To him, Catherine was a trophy, a display of virility, a radiant contradiction to the rumors of his body's collapse. He paraded her through the court with pride, holding her hand in his massive, swollen palm, laughing too loudly at her shyness, declaring to all that she was his rose without thorns. But roses do not grow in shadows, and Catherine had begun to wither. When word began to circle that the Queen had once had lovers, not during her marriage, but before Henry's court sharpened its knives, men who had smiled at her wedding now prepared affidavits. Ladies who addressed her now recalled whispers and glances, innocent flirtations, suddenly reimagined as schemes. But Catherine, poor girl, I had no idea what was coming. She was so accustomed to being scolded, not punished. She did not understand that in this court, rumors killed, and that once her name had been passed like a coin between whispering lips, there was no retrieving it. When she was arrested, she was not told why. She was taken to her rooms. The guards were polite, too polite. She asked for Henry. They said nothing. She asked again, louder this time. She demanded to see him to explain, to plead, to look into his face and remind him she was real. Not a headline, not a ghost. But he never came. He would not look at her. He would not speak her name. The same man who had clutched her waist in public now treated her as though she were the disease he feared most. Contagious, damaged, dead. And so she waited, in silence. No more sobbing, no more songs. Just the slow, grinding understanding that her end had already been decided. Her belongings were taken, her letters burned, her maids replaced by guards. One of the servants, an old woman, whispered that Anne Boleyn had slept in that same room before her execution. Catherine did not respond. There was nothing left to say. But perhaps the most tragic detail, the one history only hints at, is what happened the night before her death. They say she asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her chamber, that she practiced placing her neck upon it, that she wanted to be sure she would die with dignity, that she no longer trusted her body to obey her in front of a crowd. She had trembled too many nights. She had collapsed into too many corners. She could not risk her last moment being remembered as one of terror. And so, in the quiet dark, alone, but for the guards stationed outside her door, she rehearsed the posture of death, a girl of 19, kneeling not before God, nor before a man, but before a slab of wood where her breath would end and her silence would begin. The next morning, she walked to the scaffold in white. They say she looked like a bride, but she was no bride. She was a sacrificial lamb, dressed not for love, but for slaughter. Her last words were humble, forgiving. She asked for mercy, not for herself, but for her soul, for the king, for England. The axe fell, and just like that, the weeping stopped. But the walls remembered. The walls always remember. And if you walk through Hampton Court late at night, past the painted beams and under the heavy tapestries, they say, if the wind is right, you can still hear her. Not screaming, not begging, but softly, sadly, singing, a girl who once wept through the walls, now weeps through time. Before the sword, before the screams, before the bodies buried in silence and scandal, there were the rituals, nightly rites, not of love, but of survival, where the king's bed became less a place of comfort and more a chamber of maintenance, obsession, and disease. Every night, when the candles were trimmed low and the palace slipped into uneasy quiet, a strange procession began behind closed doors. Servants trained in secrecy moved like shadows through velvet corridors, carrying bowls of water, bundles of herbs, and stacks of clean linen that would not stay clean for long. This was the part of royal life never painted, never recorded in great tapestries, never sung by poets. This was the part everyone wanted to forget, the part that smelled like death. The rituals were not optional. They were necessary. By the time Henry had passed his 45th year, his legs had become grotesque monuments to infection. The ulcers raw. Oozing? Cavernous never closed. Instead, they deepened. They widened. They bled in ways that no physician could stop. And the king could no longer bear to be touched without first being prepared like a corpse. Each night, his body had to be unwrapped. Not gently, but slowly, carefully, like unveiling a wound that had started to believe it was alive. Bandages soaked in pus and blood were peeled back by attendants who had long since forgotten the scent of clean air. The stench, they said, was thick, clinging to walls, clothes, even the skin of the servants themselves. It was not the smell of a sick man, it was the smell of a man who had already begun to rot, piece by piece, while still drawing breath. To mask the odor, perfumes were poured into the air until the chambers choked with rose and musk and myrrh. And still, the underlying scent broke through earthy, metallic, unholy. Liters of perfumed oils were rubbed into the king's skin, not out of vanity, but to keep the decay at bay for just a few hours longer. The ulcers were packed with crushed herbs, linen strips dipped in vinegar and honey, sometimes even powdered silver. None of it worked. But the routine continued, because ritual gave the illusion of control and control was the only thing Henry had left. After the cleaning came the dressing. His legs were swaddled in layer after layer of cloth and bound in braces to keep the infected skin from splitting open under his own weight. By this point, Henry could barely walk unaided. His footsteps were slow, uneven, thudding like echoes of a war that never ended. He sat more often than he stood. He dined from chairs too wide for comfort, and when he lay in bed, it was not in the position of rest, but of strategic arrangement, pillows under his knees, pads beneath his back, all to shift pressure away from the sores that never stopped weeping. And then, finally, after the bandaging, after the oils and herbs and the muttered apologies of sweating attendants, came the inspections. These were not medical. They were paranoia, sharpened into ritual. Henry no longer trusted the women who entered his bed. He feared they carried poison in their touch, that their skin might be laced with venom, or that their lips could betray him with each kiss. The pain had infected his mind as deeply as it had his flesh. And so each night, before any queen or consort was allowed near him, she had to pass a series of humiliating tests. Salt would be sprinkled on her hands, and she would be made to lick it proof. In Henry's mind, that no poison had been smeared across her palms. She would be required to drink from his goblet before he touched it. Sometimes, she would be asked to undress in the presence of his physician, who would inspect her skin for irregularities. No woman escaped this inspection. It was degrading. It was dehumanizing. But it was law because it was his law. And in that decaying kingdom of linen and fear, Henry's word was still divine. But even that was not the most disturbing part. For in those final years, Henry began to believe that his suffering was not the result of age or illness or pride, but punishment, a curse, a divine sentence handed down by a god he once claimed to serve. And so, into the rituals crept religion, not in its comforting form, but in its darkest, most fevered expression. Crucifixes were brought into the bedchamber. Vials of holy water were poured into his bathing basins. His sheets were embroidered with verses from Scripture, and every pillow bore the mark of a saint. He kept rosary beads beneath his mattress. He demanded that the oils used on his skin be blessed by monks before application. The line between sacred and profane dissolved until his most private moments were tangled with superstition and fear. Some nights, he would not allow the Queen to touch him at all, unless she had first whispered a prayer aloud. Not just to God, but to the Holy Ghost specifically, as if some spectral intermediary might protect him from her imagined treachery. One night, he reportedly made Catherine Parr read from the Book of Psalms before he would allow her into bed. Another time, he accused a maid of harboring demons in her breath and had her dismissed without explanation. These were not the actions of a man in control. These were the habits of someone grasping for mercy from a universe that no longer answered. And behind all of this, behind the oils and the incense and the psalms and the inspections, there was the truth. No one dared to speak. The king was dying. Not in years, but in nights. Every night, he lost more of himself. More skin. More function. More sanity. The rituals became longer. More elaborate. Some nights, it would take 3 hours just to prepare him for sleep. He was no longer capable of performing the husbandly duties that once defined him, yet he refused to admit it. He would summon queens, attempt what his body could not achieve, then send them away in fury when they failed him. And afterward, the cycle would begin again. The cleaning, the bandaging, the blessing, the suspicion. Servants whispered to each other about the nights when they heard nothing from the king's chambers, no groans, no commands, not even a shuffle. And those were the most terrifying nights of all. For silence meant collapse, meant something had ruptured, or someone had finally broken beneath the pressure of pretending he was still alive in the ways that mattered most. Some believed the rituals were never meant to preserve his health, but to preserve the illusion of monarchy. As long as the king still summoned queens, still anointed his legs with oils, still demanded salt be licked, and scripture recited, then perhaps, just perhaps, the kingdom could continue to believe he was still a man, still powerful, still chosen, but it was a lie, a beautiful, grotesque, perfumed lie, and those closest to him knew it. They knew that behind the canopy, Henry had become more wound than flesh. They knew that no amount of sanctified linen could hide the truth. They knew that in the dim corners of that chamber, where prayers were whispered and bandages soaked through, the king's soul had already begun to retreat step by step, layer by layer into something unrecognizable. And every night, as the rituals ended and the final candle was snuffed out, and the bedchamber sank into silence, one could almost hear it, not breath, not sleep, but the slow drip of rot beneath royal silk, not the sound of death, but the sound of a king refusing to admit it had already arrived. By the time the blessed oils had been rubbed into his skin and the crucifixes arranged around his pillows, Henry was no longer the man whose name once terrified Europe. The body that had defied popes and armies now defied him. The limbs that once thundered across tournament fields could barely carry him from chair to bed. And worse than the ulcers, worse than the stink, worse than the endless ministrations of bandages and prayers, was the quiet truth. Henry refused to say aloud, even to himself, he could no longer perform as a husband. The king who had built a kingdom on the promise of sons could not summon a single night of potency. He was a monarch with a broken scepter, a god-king without a spark of godhood left. And each evening in that perfumed, sanctified bedchamber became a mirror he could not look into without rage. This was not a sudden fall, but a long unwinding, a cruel slow-motion humiliation that began with the accident in the year 1536 and deepened with every year after. At first, there were excuses. A cold, a wound that needed time to heal. Then there were herbs, then prayers, then more wives. Each new bride was a test, an experiment, a desperate gamble that perhaps this time his body would remember its old power. Each failure was a wound deeper than the ulcers in his legs, a cut to the center of his identity. He could still order men to die. He could still sign decrees with a flourish. He could still stand in a hall and be cheered. But in the bed, beneath the canopy, in the one arena where no decree could force compliance, Henry was powerless. And powerlessness was something he had never learned to live with. At first, he tried to hide it. Nights ended early. Audiences were delayed. A queen dismissed from the chamber under some pretext of illness. He wrapped himself in ritual-like armor, convinced that holy water, sanctified sheets, and a few muttered psalms could chase away what he called his trials, but what everyone else whispered was impotence. But the more he tried to conceal it, the more it consumed him. He began to see betrayal everywhere. A wife who did not become pregnant must be unfaithful. A servant who glanced too long must be laughing at him. An advisor who hesitated must be plotting. His bed became not just a site of physical failure, but a courtroom where he indicted women for crimes of which he was the only true perpetrator, the crime of being human, of being mortal, of being incapable of creating the heir he demanded. Catherine Howard's downfall, historians now suspect. It was not merely a matter of her flirtations before marriage, but a reflection of Henry's desperation to find an explanation for why she did not bear a child. If he could not father a son, it had to be someone else's fault. If his bedchamber was barren, It had to be poisoned. If his manhood was gone, it had to be stolen. And so he reached for the only weapon left to him: accusation. He made his queens into scapegoats, his court into a gallery of conspirators, his own shame into a public spectacle that drowned out whispers of his impotence with the screams of their trials. But impotence is not just a physical state. It is a wound to the mind. It corrodes selfhood, robs a man of his story. Henry's rages became legendary. He threw furniture. He screamed at servants. He threatened to have men executed for looking at him the wrong way. Some nights he demanded music, then hurled the instruments into the fire when the notes did not soothe him. All of it was a performance to cover the quiet truth that he had lost the one thing he believed made him a king. And as the infections in his legs grew deeper, so did the infection in his spirit, a festering resentment, a belief that God himself had betrayed him. That belief drove him to bargaining. If he executed enough traitors, perhaps heaven would restore his strength. If he humiliated enough wives, perhaps his virility would return. He measured his salvation not in prayers but in heads rolled from scaffolds, as if every beheading might be a coin dropped into some cosmic slot machine that would finally pay out in fertility and power. When the executioner's blade fell, Henry's courtiers reported seeing him smile faintly, as if some private burden had lifted, if only for a moment. But the burden never left. Night after night he returned to the same bed. The same bandages, the same prayers, the same failures. Anne of Cleves saw it first. She understood immediately upon arriving in England that this was not a marriage but a trap. She agreed to an annulment almost at once and withdrew, calling herself the king's sister rather than his wife. And in doing so she escaped the fate of the others. She refused to become another scapegoat for his humiliation. She refused to be an actor in his tragedy. And in a sense, she survived, not by luck, but by clarity. The clarity to see that Henry's wrath was no longer about love or loyalty or even politics. It was about a man unable to face himself. In the dim hours before dawn, when the perfumes had faded and the attendants had withdrawn, Henry sometimes lay awake staring at the canopy, fingers twitching against the linen embroidered with holy verses, imagining perhaps that somewhere beyond the stone walls of Whitehall there was still a world where he was young, where his legs were strong, where his nights ended not in rage but in rest. But the world inside that bed was all that remained, a world of ritual, of fear, of failure. A world where he had ceased to be a husband, ceased to be a lover, and, in his own eyes, ceased to be a man. And yet he still clung to his crown, still clung to his image, still summoned queens, still demanded that the kingdom bow before him, as if their kneeling might somehow refill the hollowness inside. In the daylight, he was Henry VIII, supreme head of the Church of England, defender of the faith. But at night, beneath the weight of his own body and the heavier weight of his shame, he was simply Henry, a sick man, an aging man, a frightened man, a man whose bedchamber had become a coffin without a lid. This was the secret history of his reign, not the treaties or the battles or the broken monasteries, but the nights, the silent, perfumed, bandaged nights where a king's body betrayed him and a king's soul learned the bitter truth that power cannot buy back youth, that ritual cannot cure rot, and that a crown cannot make a man where a man no longer stands. And so, as the kingdom slept, Henry lay awake, wrapped in holy linen and unholy terror, waiting for a dawn that never seemed to come. In the dark corridors of Henry's later reign, where incense hung heavy and holy water stained the bedding like sweat, a new theology began to take shape, not the theology of Rome or Canterbury, not of scriptures or salvation, but a grim, private gospel composed of blood, betrayal, and fear. It was a gospel Henry wrote in silence each night, between the groans of his swollen limbs and the aching void of a bed that no longer brought him sons, no longer soothed his pride, no longer assured him that he was a man. And so, like many wounded men throughout history who could not accept the decay of their flesh, Henry turned to sacrifice, not of animals, not of offerings, but of people, of women, of nobles, of anyone whose death might be exchanged, in some twisted arithmetic, for the restoration of his power. By the year 1540, executions were no longer instruments of justice in Henry's court. They had become prayers, bloody, public, irreversible prayers for the return of his manhood. He began with Catherine Howard. Her downfall had already been sealed by his suspicion, her body already doomed the moment it failed to produce the heir he could not create. But the way he worshipped her death was different. He dragged it out, built a trial of shadows and whispers, and when the executioner's axe fell, it was not regret that crossed Henry's face, but something closer to relief, as though the punishment had not only erased her failure, but purchased him a chance at redemption. The next morning, he rose with a clearer expression, though he had not slept, and that same week, he asked his physician whether it was time to consider another marriage. Not because he grieved, but because he believed that her death might have pleased God, might have balanced some unseen scale, might have opened the heavens just enough for his blood to run strong again. But of course, it didn't. So he continued. Each time, a disappointment piled too high, a failed treaty, a whisper of mockery, a rumor of laughter behind his back, he reached not for understanding, not for humility, but for the blade. He ordered deaths the way a desperate man might light candles before an altar. The executioner became a priest, the scaffold, a sanctuary, and Henry, a high priest of his own crumbling body, offering up flesh and bone in exchange for a miracle he would never receive. Historians have tried to rationalize the sudden spike in executions during the last decade of his reign. They point to political unrest, factionalism, treason, heresy. But behind all of it, beneath the ink and the scrolls and the proclamations, was the shadow of a man who believed that killing was healing, that if he spilled enough blood, his own might rise again. There are records half erased, quietly archived, that suggest Henry began requesting reports on each condemned man's confession, asking whether they wept, whether they begged, whether they mentioned the king's name before dying, as if their terror might nourish him, as if their last breath might carry his shame upward to a God who would, in exchange, restore what age had taken. Some nights, after an execution, he slept more deeply, or seemed to. Servants would report a rare quiet from his chambers. No shouting, no objects thrown. But the next night, the rot returned. The legs swelled again. The fever crept back. And he would awaken not as a man redeemed, but as a man betrayed once more by a God who had taken his strength and would not answer his sacrifices. So he offered more, not just political enemies, but old friends, loyal men, people who had once held his trust. Even Thomas Cromwell, the architect of his own religious reformation, was torn down, limb by limb, as Henry's need for blood turned inward, and yet the people still cheered. They still gathered in the squares, still watched the heads roll and believed, somehow, that these deaths were righteous, that the king's justice was divine. But it was not justice. It was grief in disguise. It was a man screaming into heaven without using his voice. A man whose scepter had long since turned into a crutch, whose crown was heavy not with gold, but with fear, and no one dared name it. No one dared say aloud that these executions were not about treason, not about faith, not even about power. They were about a king trying to punish his own body through the death of others. There are stories, mostly whispers, mostly buried, that after Catherine Howard's death, he stopped speaking her name entirely, that he had her portraits destroyed, that he avoided the rooms she once walked in, but at night, in the stillness between bandages and fever dreams, some claimed they heard him mutter a single word. Why? Not shouted, not demanded, just whispered. Like a man who had wagered everything and received nothing in return. A man who had placed his manhood on the altar of execution and watched the heavens remain closed. By the time he married Catherine Parr, his last wife, the ritual had grown quiet again. The executions slowed, not because he had changed, but because there were simply fewer left to kill, fewer names untainted, fewer women willing to play the part. Catherine Parr survived not through affection, but through caution. She learned to speak softly, to never contradict him in public, to manage his moods the way a sailor watches waves, knowing one wrong step might capsize the ship. She did not try to heal him. She tried to outlast him, and in that, she succeeded. But the kingdom was not so lucky. Henry's grief, masked as justice, carved deep scars into England's skin. Families broken, lands confiscated, children orphaned, priests hanged, poets silenced. Every death, a prayer unanswered. Every prayer, a confession unspoken. And beneath it all, the smell of rot and the sound of linen tearing under the weight of a man too sick to stand and too proud to kneel. They called him the Lion of England. They painted him with wide shoulders and sharp eyes. They gilded his name in books and hymns. But in the quiet moments in the space between an order signed and a neck struck, he was just a man, weeping behind his beard, desperate for one more night of what had long since left him. He thought executions could cure him, that if he silenced enough witnesses, the silence would become peace. But the silence only grew louder, and the rot continued. He was not born a monster. That is the cruelest part of all. In his youth, Henry was everything a court could ask for: tall, golden, broad of chest and deep of voice, fluent in languages, skilled in sport, generous with praise, radiant with possibility. He was not supposed to become this, a man of ulcers and suspicion, a king who measured his authority not by peace, but by executions, a husband whose idea of intimacy was surveillance, annulment, and steel. But time does not build character. It reveals it. And what time revealed, in the flickering candlelight of England's most secret bedchamber, was that the rot that consumed his flesh had always been mirrored in his soul, and that the monster he became was not created by fate or war or misfortune, but by the unbearable weight of his own inadequacy. What few dare say, what no textbook has the nerve to whisper, is that the entire Protestant Reformation in England, the collapse of centuries-old religious institutions, the deaths of monks and martyrs, the dissolution of holy orders, and the burning of libraries, was all born from a single, aching insecurity, a king who could not father a son, all of it the split from Rome, the elevation of Anne Boleyn, the destruction of the monasteries, the exile of loyal servants. The bloodshed of the pilgrimage of grace can be traced back to one man's refusal to admit the truth of his own body. He was not punished by God. He was not cursed by Rome. He was simply irreversibly broken. And rather than sit in that truth, rather than grieve it, Henry chose to remake the world around him in a shape that could bear his pain. He told his advisers it was about sovereignty, that no foreign pope should hold power over an English crown, that the realm deserved its own spiritual independence. But behind the proclamations and oaths, behind the ceremonies and seals, was a man who had looked into the eyes of Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, and seen the absence of a son, and so, in desperation, he tore the Church of England out of the arms of Rome, not for theology, but for personal resurrection. He believed, truly, that if he married anew, the curse would be lifted, that a second wife would deliver what the first could not. But it didn't happen. So he found a third, and when she died, he found a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth. But none of them could undo the truth. He refused to name that the failure was not in their wombs, but in him. And while his body festered in private, England bled in public. The dissolution of the monasteries displaced thousands. Lands once held sacred were sold to the highest bidders. Priests were hanged beside thieves. Books were burned in marketplaces. Men and women were forced to choose between their faith and their breath. The poor who once relied on the church for bread and healing now wandered the roads, displaced and desperate. And still, the king smiled. Still, he celebrated. Still, he spoke of destiny and glory and divine right. He covered his wounds in velvet and crushed those who questioned him beneath laws written to suit his needs. It was not just his wives who suffered. It was a kingdom, a culture, an entire people, reshaped to protect a man who could not bear to admit that he had failed in the one task he had placed above all others. They painted him as Solomon, as David, as Caesar, but he was none of these. He was Oedipus, blind by choice. He was Herod, cruel to the innocent. He was Narcissus, drowning in his own reflection. And each time the world disappointed him, each time his body betrayed him, he reached not for introspection, but for someone else's throat. This is what unchecked power does when placed in the hands of a man at war with himself. It infects not just the body, but the court, the country, the century. Henry's psychological wounds became England's political blueprint: distrust, division, suppression, and spectacle. He taught those who followed that when you fear your own weakness, you must project strength, that when you cannot perform, you must punish, that when you lose your grip, you must tighten the noose. His courtiers learned this lesson well. So did the generations that followed. And perhaps the cruelest legacy of all was not the blood, but the silence. For centuries, the truth of Henry's failures was buried beneath reverence and lies. Scholars spoke of his strength. Biographers romanticized his ambition. Even his cruelties were framed as necessary. His killings as calculated, but they were not. They were desperate. They were the flailing of a man whose identity had unraveled and who mistook destruction for deliverance. There are no monuments to the wives who bled beside him in silence. No grand cathedrals for the monks turned beggars. No statues for the girls who sobbed into embroidered pillows behind the same wall where the king plotted his next marriage. But their shadows remain. Their echoes haunt the palaces. And when the wind shifts through the old stone towers, it is not the voice of Henry that lingers, but the whisper of all those who were silenced to protect his illusion. The monster that made an era bleed was not a tyrant from birth. He was a man who could not bear the truth of himself. And in trying to kill that truth, he killed everything around it. So when you hear of the Reformation, of the new church, of the birth of a modern England, remember what lay beneath it? Not just doctrine, not just politics, but pain, personal, unbearable, unspoken pain, and blood, so much blood. There is a silence that comes at the end of every reign, not the silence of trumpets fading or courtiers bowing for the last time, but the silence that sinks deep into stone, into wood, into the old bones of a kingdom that has wept and bled beneath the weight of one man's needs. It is the silence that arrives after the last execution, after the final kiss of the axe against trembling neck, after the last breath is drawn in a bed too large for one man alone. And when that silence finally came for Henry, when the rot that had long feasted on his flesh at last conquered his crown, England did not rejoice. It did not collapse. It did not even exhale. It simply adjusted, as if the kingdom had long been practicing how to live without him, even while pretending it could not. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January in the year 1547, in the Palace of Whitehall, surrounded by priests, physicians, and fear. His body had become monstrous. The ulcers on his legs had grown so deep and infected that they were said to reach the bone. He could no longer walk. He could barely breathe. The sheets beneath him had to be changed constantly, soaked through with pus and blood, and yet no one dared speak of it openly, even in death. He was protected by a wall of silence and reverence, as though the truth of his decline might infect the realm if acknowledged aloud. They said he confessed, that he asked forgiveness, that he died with dignity. But these are the fictions courts whisper when they are too afraid to admit that their king died, afraid, in agony, beneath the weight of his own contradictions. And in the days that followed, even as his body was embalmed and entombed in layers of ceremony, the rot could not be hidden. The coffin itself began to leak. Black fluid seeped from the seams. And when the cortege paused at Sion Abbey on the journey to Windsor, dogs were seen licking the puddle beneath the casket. A detail so grotesque, so unforgettable, that it found its way into legend. The body of a king, once worshipped as God's voice on earth, now oozing into the floor while mongrels lapped at what was left of him. But the truth is, the rot had never been just physical. It had lived in him long before the first ulcer, before the first fever. It lived in his need to dominate, to rewrite, to destroy. It lived in his refusal to be ordinary, to be weak, to be mortal. He could not allow himself to be just a man, because if he was, then the world would have to answer for the lives it had shattered on his behalf. So he crowned himself not just with gold, but with myth, with blood, with the fantasy that a man could be so powerful, so divine, that even his decay would become holy. But beneath the layers of velvet, beneath the perfumed bandages and the holy oils, was a boy who had once wanted to be loved, a son who was never meant to be king, a brother who watched his older sibling die and inherited a crown he had never truly prepared to wear, and maybe, just maybe, a man who, in the deepest corner of the night, heard the ghosts of the wives he had destroyed whispering from the other side of the canopy. Anne, head severed, but spirit unbowed. Catherine, aged and cast aside, dying alone and unloved. Jane, the bled dry after giving him the son he thought would make him whole. Anne of Cleves, clever enough to escape. Catherine Howard, too young to survive him. Catherine Parr, exhausted but intact. They were more than wives. They were reflections, mirrors held up to his deepest fears. And each time he saw something he could not bear: infertility, defiance, aging, knowledge, he shattered the glass and punished the image. And still, the wound remained, because the wound was never in them. It was always in him. And so we are left with this: a king who broke a nation to soothe his pride, who burned his soul into the annals of history not through love or wisdom or glory, but through pain. A man who turned his bed into a battlefield, his prayers into punishments, his failures into fire. And centuries later, we still study him, still name schools after him, still line museum walls with his portraits, the wide stance, the bejeweled hands, the eyes that dare us to look away. But behind those eyes was a child who never learned how to be gentle with his grief, who mistook domination for strength, who called cruelty justice and called justice love. So what do we learn from Henry? That power, unchecked, will always rot the body first, and the world second. That the divine right of kings was never divine, only dangerous, perhaps. But there is something else, too, something quieter, something that lingers not in the history books, but in the dark spaces between them. We learn that even the greatest crowns sit upon mortal heads, that even kings bleed, that even empires fall not in thunder, but in silence. And that somewhere, in a chamber heavy with smoke and memory, a dying man once lay beneath a canopy, listening for the voice of God, hearing nothing but the sound of his own body, unraveling, one heartbeat at a time. Sleep now, for the story is over. The monster has gone quiet, and England, though never truly healed, has learned how to carry his shadow, not with pride, but with caution